Thanks, Tim. I wish very sincerely that it would have been this book that was burned. It got a lot of publicity. Well, we're here to talk about school choice today, and it's a favorite subject of Joe and myself. And I think we've reached some serious turning points in the last 10 years, and so I recently put some material together that I think indicates that very well with turning points in scope, or the scope of school choice, the legislation that's been passed around the country. And particularly of interest to me is research on effectiveness, because why have school choice unless it's going to help students learn better and it's better for our country? When we say school choice, we're talking about, just to be sure, we're all talking about the same thing. The families can choose the best public or private school for their children, so it's the parents that are in charge. It has the characteristics, ultimately, of free enterprise, which has been well established to encourage innovation of various kinds, competition, reduce cost, better performance, and accommodation to a variety of parent and student preferences. It's very unlike, for example, the Common Core, which the federal government wants to have all students pursuing the same curriculum. Rather, we recognize that people are different, and students have different abilities and interests, and their parents have recognition of their talents, and they may want a special school for their children. So the public sector tends not to feature that. Now, since we published the book, there have been a number of significant changes. The bulk of all states now have some provision for charter schools. And what I mean by that, again, sorry for definitions, but I think we should be talking about the same things. This is public funds being used for public schools, but they are privately governed, and they have private boards, and so they can pursue various kinds of innovations, and they tend to be different from one another. They started in Minnesota in 1991, and there are now approximately 5,000. I think that we've made turning points, as I indicated when I opened here today, but we still have a very long way to go. There are 5,000 roughly charter schools in the United States, but a number of states don't allow them. And even the states that do allow charter schools have limits on how many charter schools there can be. And someone was mentioned to me a little earlier today that even here in Chicago, there is a strong tendency for the charter schools to become unionized. And in addition to that, there is the problem, since they're getting public funds, they're getting public regulations, which make them like traditional public schools. So they're going to be regulated more than they have in the past. Tax tuition credits are a significant development, and the last time I checked, they were available in 10 states, and this allows parents to deduct the tuition that they may pay at a private school from their income taxes. There are only 10 states to do it, and the big problem, and I would say that it's somewhat more feasible, say, than vouchers, but still only 10 states have it, and the states put a severe limitation on how much you can deduct. So it's really not that significant. The other problem is that if you're poor, you don't pay taxes anyway. Say you don't have any special inducement to make use of tax tuition credits. Now, even vouchers are probably the most controversial, and we've made some progress there, but there's still a very, very long way to go. Our neighboring state, which seems to be eclipsing Illinois these days with privatization, had the Supreme Court there ruled that the 2011 Choice Scholarship Program is constitutional, and the program allows poor families to receive vouchers equal to 50 to 90% of the state's pupil education funding to use in private schools. So that is a significant development, but many states don't even, and the legislators are not even talking about vouchers. Heartland has been pushing, and I think justifiably so, the parent trigger. And there are lots of variations on this. Started in California But one variation is if 51% of the parents in a school, particularly a failing school that's been designated a failing school by the state, sign a petition, the school has to face various consequences. Among those consequences are closing the school and allowing the kids to go to other public schools or private schools, or chartering the schools, chartering the school. So that is a significant development, and about 20 states are thinking about or considering legislation. Now the big question is, does it work or not? And I tried to answer that question in the year 2007, and there's a book in the back of the room where I summarize the current research, and at the time, and I've since reviewed it again, and I did that on charter schools and private schools and voucher programs of various kinds. And there were dozens, if not hundreds, of studies that could be summarized. And overall, it indicated, oh, he's holding up the book, so there it is, school choice. It has separate chapters on each one of the types of school choice that I had mentioned to you. And overwhelmingly, the results indicate that private schools, and I'm using all 4 or 5 variants that I described to you, do better. And one of the most significant things is that they provide a superior achievement in the standard school subjects, being math, English, foreign languages, science, and social studies. But in addition, the parents are more satisfied, the students are more satisfied, higher graduation rates. But the most significant point, well, I shouldn't say that. One of the most significant points is cost. Private institutions tend to provide superior services at lower cost. It's my phone, and I'm sorry. I'm not going to answer it. I don't know if I could destroy it or what. Well, let's stop. Anyway, what I found is, and we don't have complete information on this because private schools are, by definition, private. We don't know what they cost in all cases. But I found 5 significant studies that compared the cost of private schools, and when I say private, I mean parochial and independent. And when you took the average cost of those private schools and compared them to the public schools in the same neighborhood, the private schools were about half the cost. This is particularly significant in the United States because in the surveys that have been done in the last 20 years of countries, the United States is ranked 1st or 2nd in per student costs, and yet we've been as low as 25th in mathematics and science, which are the most comparable subjects. So we get very, very poor performance, very, very high cost. There's another field like that in the United States that we need to be equally worried about for the same reasons. That's medicine, where we spend huge amounts of money, and yet we have very bad rates of infant mortality and life expectancy. So the privatization offers a good solution to some of the school costs that we face. Some of the studies that were done that I summarized in the book and continue to have the same findings are that parents are more satisfied with their schools, and that the private schools have a good reputation, a better reputation than public schools in the same regional area or neighborhood. So there are some very, very good reasons for advancing this. And the other reason is, even if we didn't have this research on schools themselves, there have been a whole bunch of studies on privatization of goods and services in various industries. And just to, so you know the full scope, there have been studies done in airlines, banks, bus service, debt collection, electric utilities, forestry, hospitals, housing. These are all in alphabetical order, you notice. Insurance sales and processing, railroads, refuge collection, savings and loans, slaughterhouses, water utilities, and weather forecasting. And you can imagine if the government provided food services, we'd all be eating spinach for breakfast on Tuesday mornings. So it not only provides superior services at lower cost, but it accommodates different preferences that people have. Now for that reason, there is now it's only in the beginning. I'm not making any claim that it's any more extensive then maybe we're a fifth of the way or a tenth of the way. But you see parallel developments, if not in the United States and in other countries around the world, where it would have been unheard of 25 years ago. Can you imagine privatizing prisons, police, fire protection, and public pensions? So this is part of a larger picture that economists have shown us. Also, there is the private contracts with public institutions contracting with private firms. And the big inducement, the parallel here would be with vouchers or with charter schools. If they're not providing a good service, they can be diminished in terms of the money they get, or they can lose the contract, or they may even have to go out of business. But that's not true of the public schools. They go on and on and on. I'm sure you read about so many of failing public schools in the United States that are not being replaced. I think one of the most interesting examples, which is more recent than our book, was the KIP, Knowledge is Power program, and it indicates that some of these things can reach out far, far more than most charter schools do. I was on the board of the largest charter school in the United States here in Chicago called the Chicago International Charter School. We had 11 campuses when I resigned from the board. But KIP now has 41,000 students in 20 states, and it's been expanding vastly. And independent studies have indicated that the kids in the KIP schools are 8 months ahead of their public school peers in reading, 11 months ahead in mathematics, and 14 months ahead in science. Similarly, another study done at Stanford University indicated that they were roughly about a year ahead of the regular public schools. One of the least recognized issues in the United States is the poor performance of our top students. While we have some of the very best universities in the world, a Chinese study indicated we have 17 of the 20 top universities in the world. But if you actually look at in science and math, that is, if you actually look at those places, many of those top students are from China, India, and places like that. In fact, I taught for 30 years at UIC. In case you don't know it, as a Chicagoan, that stands for the University of Indians and Chinese. But we attract smart people from all over the world, but I'm talking about school choice. And there we have done far less well for the top students. So one way to study that is through international surveys to say, what is the percentage of the students in the country that are in the top 5% of all countries? And the United States does particularly poorly there. One of the reasons for that is with Common Core and with a lot of other state programs, there's a kind of minimal level of competency required so that the people in the school and the school district, the superintendent, and others are putting all of their energies and their money too into bringing up the bottom. But far more significant is raising the top, because those are the people who tend to be in those STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And a study of about 90 countries shows a strong correlation between the scores of the top students and the country's economic growth and welfare. So this is a particular problem in the United States, and we seem to be moving actually in the wrong direction. There are a lot of reasons why all of this happens, but I just want to indicate very briefly before I ask my colleague Joe to speak, is that we have an extremely complex system. We have some degree of school governance, which used to be universal in colonial times, because the schools were governed by a small rural community. There might have only been, let's say, 1,000 people in a small rural community, and the board knew the teachers and the students extremely well. But what has happened in the last 150 years is you have bigger and bigger school districts. We used to have 115,000 of them. Now we only have 15,000. And as the districts got bigger and bigger, they became more and more bureaucratic. Secondly, The states now are pitching in about 50% of the cost of education. So you have state governance on top of what used to be small-scale local governance. And now, too, the federal government is moving in with all kinds of regulations. And in the meantime, as education administrators want to move up, they have to think of something new. So they call that reform du jour, the reform of the day. And so there's this constant changing around of one program to another, and who's responsible when everybody's responsible. So that is one of the reasons why the United States it is arguably had the strongest school system in the world, let's say 150 or 200 years ago, and we assimilated all kinds of immigrants, and many of them non-English speaking immigrants. They came to the United States, and by the way, the private schools did a wonderful job with them because many of them were parochial schools or schools right in the neighborhood where there's an identification with an ethnic group or a religious group, and it helped a lot with them assimilating into American society. And so it can be argued that we don't have the hard numbers that we would like on achievement, but it could be argued that we had a miracle in our public education and semi-private education system, and today we're a laggard at very high costs. So I think, Joe, it might be the time for you to be discussing some of the reasons why this has happened.
Thank you, Herb. Thank you, everyone, for attending this little meeting. I had a meeting this morning that ran long, so it actually ran right up until 10 after 11, I think, and I had meant to spend a little more time preparing, so I apologize in advance if this is a little more impromptu than a typical presentation might be. I'd like to thank Herb. Herb Walberg is a remarkable person. Herb is an academic. He's also a philanthropist, and he's also a very courageous guy. To be a professor of education today, advocating for the things that he's advocating is rare. It puts your career at risk, and you don't get a lot of rewards for it. You're not going to get all of the accolades and all of the plum assignments and all of the titles and awards that you get if you stay in the more politically correct pro-public school cartel kind of mode. So Herb is an amazing guy. He's also been the chairman of the board of the Heartland Institute now for 10 years or 15 years or 18 years, something like that. So thank you, Herb. You've been a mentor for me, and I know hundreds and hundreds of students over the years, and you're just an amazing guy. Really appreciate it. The first book that the Heartland Institute ever published in 1986 was on school reform. We Can Rescue Our Children. It was a tiny little paperback book, and we advocated tax credits. We said that if people could take a portion of their property taxes and take that with them if they chose a private school, that we would create competition and choice, and that the school system in Chicago would be dramatically improved. That proposal actually had legs. It was down in Springfield. It was put into a bill. I'm trying to remember the name of the professor at Northwestern University, Bacalus. Mike Bacalus. Do you remember Mike Bacalus? Yeah. Mike was very much in favor of it. Mike and I gave presentations, and we actually got close to getting that thing passed. If you can imagine the impact that something like that would have had, if we could have had thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of kids attending private schools in Chicago, taking a percentage of their property taxes with them to pay tuition, I think the world would be a lot different today. It was our first book because the issue is the most important issue that we can possibly address. Heartland talks about entitlement reform, healthcare reform, environment issues, finance and insurance and real estate, all of these public policy issues. Most of it tracks back to education. The most important thing is how we educate kids. Kids who are in high school today are going to be voting in the next presidential election. Okay, 1 million kids are going to graduate and they're going to be voting. And who are they going to vote for? You know, if they don't know anything about civics, if they don't know anything about economics, if they're not getting instruction on virtue at home, it's unlikely they're getting it in the school. Who are these kids going to vote for? Probably not a guy who's talking about the Constitution, limited government, free enterprise, and creating jobs. So what happens in the schools determines the outcome of a lot of these other public policy debates. And it's the reason why it was our first book. It was one of the very first articles that we ever published. It was the first letter to the editor in the Chicago Tribune that I ever got published. It's an issue that's been really at the core of the Heartland Institute and very important to me for my entire life. The book that we're talking about today, Education and Capitalism, was really ahead of its time. We distributed on the order of 12,000 copies of this book over the years. It got a lot of feedback, a lot of pushback from libertarians and conservatives, among others. But it also, I think, crossed, maybe for that reason, it crossed the line and got the attention of liberals and Democrats all across the country. To this day, I'm still getting people saying, I got that book, I loved it, it's really interesting, thank you so much for sending it to me. The book is a little bit of a misdirection. I wouldn't say a fraud, but it's a little bit of a misdirection. Education and Capitalism, half of the book is about capitalism and half of it is about education. The sections that are about capitalism aren't really about education, if you get that distinction. So we're kind of hoping that people's interest in education, in school reform, would kind of trick them into reading a book that educates them about capitalism and how it works. The basic theme of the book was the biggest reason why we're not getting more reform in education is because people don't understand capitalism. They're afraid of it. And if you think capitalism is destroying the environment or causing unemployment or making the rich get richer and the poor get poor or is responsible for the last Great Depression, then why would you trust your kids to capitalism? Why would you allow for-profit schools to educate your kids? Why would you assume that we can have a competitive marketplace in education when a competitive marketplace has led to all of these terrible things in other areas? And that's what we tried to address in this book. So there are chapters that specifically talk about what is capitalism, how does it work, what are some of the myths about capitalism that are playing in the backs of people's minds when we're talking about school reform. And having addressed all of that and hopefully cleared it up, then we can have an informed conversation about how capitalism, competition, choice, and freedom can improve public education in the United States. So that was kind of the theme and the overall content of this book. What I'd like to talk about very briefly are three things: vouchers as a political strategy, vouchers versus tax credits, and the fear of regulations under vouchers. These are three areas that are especially, I think, controversial within the conservative and libertarian movement, much less so among liberals. They object to school choice and vouchers for their own set of reasons, which I think Herb has addressed and are pretty easily dismissed. But these three keep coming up in conversation with conservatives and libertarians. And as school choice and vouchers looks like it's reached a tipping point, we've had more progress in the last 2 years than in the last 30 years in getting voucher programs passed and tax credit plans passed all around the country. There's almost 250,000 kids now are attending private schools using tax credits or vouchers. And 80% of that has happened in the last 4 or 5 years. So it's a real turning point. Increasingly, the voices of opposition are conservatives and libertarians rather than liberals. So at the moment that it looks like victory is at hand, we've got divisions within our own movement that are now becoming critics of further expansion of school choice. So I'd like to address all three of those things. Starting with vouchers as a strategy for change. Vouchers are a means and not an end. What is the end? The end is a transformation of education in the United States. I think Herb mentioned the international competitions or studies that show the United States ranks very low among other countries. It's clear from objective international standards that our schools are doing a much more poor job than the schools in other countries all around the world. And in an age of globalism, that has real implications. We can't expect to continue to be competitive with other countries if we have schools that aren't performing as well as schools in other countries. We have this huge gap in achievement between low-income and minority kids and upper-income and non-minority kids. That's a huge problem. It's tearing up the social fabric of the country. It's condemning whole generations of minority kids and low-income kids to jobs and careers or prison or worse. that are not as fulfilling as those of the other kids that they see. It fuels resentment. I think it's sort of an acid on our democratic society. We're seeing the invasion of political correctness into the curriculums of schools. Those of you who follow the global warming issue, and those of you who have kids, your kids have seen Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth probably 5 times already in their public schools. That thing is just a piece of propaganda that's designed to advance a very partisan political agenda. There's almost no science in it, and yet that's tolerated and encouraged in public schools. That's just the tip of the iceberg of the kind of stuff that's being taught in public schools all across the country. That's a huge problem. So we need not just to reform public K-12 schools, we need to transform these schools. We need to take them to a whole nother level. Technology is transforming other industries. We all see it every day in our lives. It hasn't transformed education, even though it should. You would think that with the new distance learning technologies and computer-assisted learning, all of these new advancements, that kids should be able to get a high school diploma in 11 years instead of 12, or 10 instead of 12, or 9 or 8. It should be enhancing the productivity of our schools, and in fact it hasn't. And a big reason is teacher unions and administrators and principals and superintendents are resisting the introduction of this technology into the schools. They're trying to protect jobs instead of putting the interests of kids first. So it's an example of why we need transformational change, not just reform at the margins, if we want to get some really big improvements in the achievement of our public schools. So we need that kind of change. I think there are 3 things we need to overcome. There's lots of things we need to overcome. There are 3 really big problems that we need to overcome that vouchers act as a strategy to overcome. The first one is the power of special interest groups. Teacher unions, for sure, and the conservatives among us are very familiar with how teacher unions raise and spend millions of dollars and mobilize millions of hours of volunteer time in order to block voucher and tax credit initiatives all around the country. But it's not just the teacher unions. The superintendents are even worse. The problem we've got in Texas is all the superintendents, public school superintendents, lobby their members of the legislature to oppose any kind of school choice initiatives. So the superintendents, the principals, all the bureaucrats, all the suppliers going into the public schools. Some of us are following the Common Core controversy or debate. That's largely driven by textbook publishers and some of these other big companies that want to get their hand in or their place at the trough for public school funding. So all these interest groups stand in the way of the kind of transformation that we're looking for. Vouchers is a way to break that up. When 2 schools have to compete with one another for students and for funding, it's a lot harder for them to adopt policies that are anti-effective or that lower their productivity. Schools that have to compete end up saying, well, let's pay the math teacher more than the English teacher. There's a novel idea. But most public schools don't do that, can't do that. But if they had to compete for kids and for tuition, they would start doing that. Maybe we need to lengthen the school day. Maybe we need to lengthen the school year. Maybe we need a better focus on some of the common, I'll call it Common Core curriculum stuff that should be at the center of what kids are learning, and maybe have fewer options like portfolio preparation and all of the stuff that they're throwing into the curriculum these days. Competition does all of that, and it breaks up the unions because now the workers in 2 schools are competing instead of coming together to oppose any competition. It gets the superintendents in the mode of trying to make their schools better and more competitive. So it breaks up the interest groups that right now are the major block to the kind of transformation we're looking for. The second obstacle that we face is public distrust of capitalism. And I talked about that a little bit, so I won't have to repeat it. But if everybody is going around with this little song going in their head that says capitalism is evil and bad and we can't trust competition and choice, you're not going to get where we need to go. Vouchers gets them over that problem. When they see charter schools and private schools that are actually doing a good job, when they see parents making smart choices to put their kids in the school that better matches their kids' special needs, it demonstrates that actually competition and choice could work in education. It's not such a radical idea after all. Vouchers is the way to put a face on the benefits of choice and competition. And without vouchers, if you think we can get to a complete private education system in a single leap, people are going to say, I can't believe that that could work, because they've never seen it work. So vouchers is a good way to address some of those concerns and overcome the public's innate distrust of capitalism. And the third obstacle is fear of a painful or disorderly transition. And in the 29 years that I've been talking about school choice and vouchers, I can't tell you how many times I've run into libertarian or conservative activists in the school choice arena who haven't given a single thought to the idea that maybe the schools are going to get disrupted if all of a sudden we go from the current system to one where every parent gets a check and is told to send their kids to the school of their choice. Whoa, parents think about this and they say, wait a minute, my school might shut down. I've all of a sudden got 6 choices of schools. I got to come up with extra money to pay for the tuition at the school that I want. What's going to happen? You can't just take a system that's operated for 200 years as it's currently set up and throw all the cards up in the air and then hope that they all land right. Parents understand that. Parents are risk averse. And vouchers is a good way to keep that system more or less intact, okay, and give them interim steps and say, okay, we're going to phase this in. If you don't want to participate, don't. Private schools don't have to take the voucher. Parents don't have to choose private schools. They can keep their kid in the public school. Parents are reassured by this. And it's not just a concession, it's not a compromise, it's the reality that parents want to see a soft landing ahead for this reform idea. They don't want it to happen all overnight. And vouchers are a way to do that. So strategically, for those 3 reasons, I think vouchers are the way that we can transform schools in America. It's a halfway house. You got to go through it if you think you're going to get out to the other end. You can't do it in a single jump. Second thing is vouchers versus tax credits. And this always came up at our table right here with Bob. Why not prefer tax credits over vouchers? A lot of libertarians do. And they think that they support tax credits because it's less likely that participating schools will end up being regulated. Since the taxpayer, rather than the school, would apply to the government for the tax credit, it's less likely regulatory strings will accompany the payments. And since parents must pay for tuition first and only then apply for the credit, tax credits preserve the element of personal financial sacrifice that may encourage closer monitoring by parents of schools. I'm reading this from my own summary of the argument because I think I'm very familiar with the argument. I think it's false for a couple of reasons. First, the threat of regulation is no less under a tax credit plan than it is under a voucher program. It all depends on how the legislation is written. States already have a virtually unlimited authority to regulate private schools. Okay? There is no constitutional restriction on how much a state can regulate its schools. That's been established by the Supreme Court. It's the rule of the land. So they might be looking for excuses to regulate private schools. A voucher might give them an excuse to regulate private schools that they didn't have previously, but so do tax credits. Okay? So if you're going to give somebody a tax credit to attend that school, why not put some restrictions on it and say, well, if that school teaches hatred of other ethnic groups, then your tax credit doesn't work at that school. And in fact, that's what Arizona says in its legislation, its tax credit legislation. And well, why not require that you not discriminate on the basis of sex or religion or this or that or the other thing, that you have to have your kids come in through a lottery instead of first come, first serve? You can impose all those restrictions under a tax credit just as easily as you can under a voucher program. So problem number 1 is there's nothing inherent or unique about a tax credit plan that makes it immune to regulation. Secondly, let's see. This is where my lack of preparation is going to start to show up. The amount of money that a tax credit plan can deliver is much less than a voucher program can deliver. What happens is most of us all of us who rent or own a home, we pay property taxes either directly or indirectly through our rent payment all our lives. That money pays for about half or 2/3 of the cost of public schools. In any given year, the amount that we pay in taxes is less than what the public schools are spending to educate a child. And if you have 2 or 3 or 4 kids attending public school at any one time, you are imposing a cost of $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 on your community. That's how much is being spent to educate your kids. A tax credit is not going to be that much. You're going to get a much smaller tax credit than that. So the amount of the tax credit, if it's an individual tax credit, is going to be small relative to the cost of tuition and small relative to what the public schools are currently spending. Whereas the voucher can be for 50% or 75% of the total amount that the public schools are spending. Tax credit advocates try to get around that by saying, well, let's create scholarship granting entities, nonprofit organizations, to which individuals or companies can make tax deductible contributions. So you get your tax break by putting $100,000 into this entity, then this entity turns around and gives scholarships to the kids who apply. It does overcome the problem, but what have you got now? Now you've got these nonprofit organizations, these scholarship granting entities, which are going to raise a tiny fraction of the total amount that's currently being spent by the government on the schools. Okay, and in all the states that have these programs, none of them has reached 2% of what the public sector is spending on public K-12 education. So it's an almost trivial amount. As Herb mentioned, that's why these laws pass, is because the teacher unions know it's a trivial amount. It's not a real threat. They don't worry about it. Similarly, they don't defund the public schools. When a kid moves from a public school to a private school, does the public school lose any funding under a tax credit plan? No, it doesn't lose anything. So you're not tearing down the old system while you're building up a new system. In fact, you're subsidizing the old system. Fewer kids, same amount of money. Is that system now less open to reform? Of course not. It's just the opposite. You're actually strengthening your opponents and doing very little good for the other side. And finally, I fail to see how this system empowers parents or makes parents any more accountable for the results of their kids' education. Instead of now going to the government and asking for permission to send your kid to a government school, you go to a nonprofit organization and ask for permission to send your kid to a school. The nonprofit organization defines which schools, gets to decide whether or not your kid gets to attend that school. There's no empowerment there. And if anything, it's worse, because at least with the government, we have an entitlement to send our kid to a school. Okay, it might be a lousy school. We may not be able to choose which one, but at least he goes to school. These nonprofit scholarship granting entities have no obligation to pay the tuition for my kid's school. It's a charity solution to what is actually an entitlement problem. We need to reform the entitlement, not just come up with a new charity device. And lastly, on the constitutional issue, the U.S. Supreme Court has made it pretty clear that vouchers are in fact constitutional. The decisions at the national level now, I think, are very clear. States, whenever they pass a voucher plan, the teacher unions try to whip up some litigation. Over and over again, that litigation turns in our direction, as it's made clear that the U.S. Supreme Court has said, so long as the money goes to the parents and not directly to the school, and so long as it doesn't bias the parents' choice in the direction of a religious school versus a secular school, then it's constitutional. One of the neat things about the constitutional issue is the Supreme Court has ruled that voucher programs are constitutional so long as they do not create entanglement between the government and schools. There cannot be excessive entanglement, which means not too much regulation, not too much interference with the mission of the school. If you try to do that, then in fact the courts would say that that's an unconstitutional program. Well, that works into a protection for voucher programs and for schools that participate in voucher programs that doesn't exist for tax credit programs. So if I'm a private school, I'm in a voucher program, the state tries to regulate me, I say, hey, that's excessive entanglement. You can't do that. I have a constitutional right to participate in this program without excessive regulation. Schools don't have a similar right under tax credit programs. Under a tax credit program, a state can regulate participating schools any way it wants. All right, and finally, the third thing I wanted to talk about is avoiding regulation. Is it the case that anytime government funds something, regulations follow? Is it the case that he who pays the piper calls the tune? Is that the expression? There is a long tradition of really great libertarian writers who I respect a lot making that argument and saying that this pretty much means that a voucher program leads to regulation of private schools. We don't want that. It's going to destroy the remnant of good private schools that are left in America. I think that argument has to be respected because it has been around a long time. Some of the really great thinkers have made that objection. On the other hand, why would Milton Friedman, probably the greatest libertarian of our lifetime, support vouchers if that was the case? Milton Friedman was not blind to the threat of government regulating schools. He embraced vouchers because he understood that vouchers of all the types of privatization that Herb Walberg mentioned in his comments is the least restrictive, the least likely to lead to regulations. Steve Savas. I'm looking at Diane. She's my walking Rolodex on stuff like this. Steve Savas is one of the world's really great experts on privatization. He's written a dozen books on it. He has created a little taxonomy of privatization, which goes from the least regulatory to the most regulatory, the least free market, or just the opposite, the most free market to the least free market. Vouchers are the most free market type of privatization that you can envision because the money goes to the suppliers and not to the to the customers, not to the suppliers. What happens when you subsidize a supplier, if you gave the money directly to the schools, you would end up with regulations on the supplier. When the U.S. Department of Defense pays a company to make a tank or a gun, it's going to give them a book this thick of rules and guidelines and specifications for it. But when you subsidize consumers, you don't see those books. Social Security. Some of you are on Social Security. Did you get a book when you qualified for Social Security that said, okay, here's the rules and regulations on how you can spend that money? Okay, you can't spend it on this, you can't spend it on that. No, you didn't get the book because there are no regulations on consumers under Social Security. There really aren't. You can take your Social Security check, turn it over, say St. Paul's, and put it in the collection box. And St. Paul's Church can cash that check. So much for separation of government and state. There are no regulations because the money goes to consumers and not to suppliers. Food stamps are the same way. Grocery stores are not being regulated because government is financing food stamps. The nexus was broken by making the choice a voucher instead of a direct grant to the supplier. So that's the most important thing when you're talking about vouchers. That is the argument that persuaded Milton Friedman to support vouchers. Regulations don't follow government subsidies when the subsidies go to consumers rather than to producers. I've already mentioned the second strongest reason. States do not need vouchers to give them the authority to regulate private schools. They've already got that authority. So don't think that somehow this is enhancing the power of the state over private schools. Anytime they want, government can come in and shut down private schools. The only reason they don't is because the parents who are sending their kids to private schools oppose them. Go down to Springfield and lobby and demand that new regulations not be imposed on their schools. So the question you got to ask is that going to happen more often or less often under a voucher program? And I think the answer is more often. More parents are going to go down to Springfield and say, keep your hands off of my school if you've got 20% of the kids attending private schools instead of only 7% or 6%, whatever it is now in Illinois. So by increasing the number of kids and parents who have an interest in private schools, we create a larger, more powerful special interest group that is opposed to more regulations. Okay, it changes the dynamic. It actually results in less regulation and not more regulation. And lastly, good legislation. You can write a voucher bill that has language in it that can very specifically shut down and discourage additional regulation. Now, this is not an absolute protection. It will never be because a simple majority of a state legislature is required to pass the legislation, and a simple majority can repeal or amend the legislation. So you are always one legislative session away from all your great language and your great legislation from being reversed by a hostile governor and legislature. But at least you can try, and we've been trying for 50 years since this idea was first being talked about in the 1960s to come up with good legislation that makes sure that the legislature does not have increased power under this bill. And I could read it off to you, but it appears in various books. I'm sure it's in Education and Capitalism. But there's very specific language that says no new regulation shall be imposed on any school that participates in this program. One neat thing, the only thing I'll mention specifically, is a provision that says in any legal proceeding challenging this statute or any regulations on private schools, the state shall fund the defenders of private schools, in effect. Private schools will have legal standing to defend themselves in litigation and then have the state cover their legal expenses. Because otherwise it's a very unbalanced playing field where the Department of Education, which is often just defending public schools, gets unlimited legal resources to defend itself or to attack private schools. So the legislation can give private schools legal standing and the resources they need to defend themselves. So those are my 3 points. All of them are made even better than what I just did in this really terrific book. We do have additional copies of it. If you would like to buy additional copies, talk to us, let us know. We can give you bulk discounts. I think it's still a very timely and very important book on a very important topic. Thanks again for being here. I'm happy to take questions. With Dr. Walberg.
First question, Herb, you had mentioned something. For those of us who follow the debate, the big trick now of the defenders of the status quo is to say that if you parse out the data, all of our rich white kids are doing great. They're comparable with all the rich white kids in Finland and all the rich white kids in Germany. And the real problem is just the poor black kids and the Hispanic kids. And they're using that argument to say our schools are just fine because our good schools are still great. What is the best source, perhaps in one of your many books, what is the best source to, their best argument to defeat that, their argument on that they're making now?
Well, I just touched on that very briefly, but there was a recent study that of 90 countries, of the top 5% of students in all countries, and the United States does poorly on that ranking. I don't know whether they ranked at 50th or whatever it was, but we certainly are not among the top 10 or 20. But I do acknowledge, on the other hand, the critics have said that there are big differences between middle-class kids and poor kids, and that is true. So we have a lot of different problems. Our averages are bad, but our discrepancies between the rich and the poor with respect to achievement are also bad, and I think that's another reason why we have to have the privatization, which can accommodate students with various levels of ability, and we particularly ought not to hold our brightest kids back, which is not sufficiently recognized. We're all concerned about poor kids, but we ought to be concerned about those kids on the top too because of that study.
I agree. Chris?
A couple of points. Number one is there a center that is evaluating pro-establishment studies that are cited, like the one Bruno, this is a theme that's discernible out there, and providing the critical points to rebut those, as they're coming out? That's number one. Number two, in Illinois, there's growing interest in consolidation. Now, there's functional and then there's institutional, and probably for a lot of establishment reasons, functional is going to happen before institutional. But I wonder if a school with if a district with one high school and 4 or 5 feeders, if that isn't a little incubator for the application of vouchers, because parents in that high school attendance area could then have immediate access to any of the 5 feeders, and they could distinguish themselves: arts, science, mathematics, etc. Finally, number 3, how do we calculate? I mean, Joe, you were saying the 50 to 75% for the value of the voucher. What is there, I mean, what are the competing formulas? Which one do you like? What's the principle at work in computing 55% as opposed to 80% or whatever it is? What comes in to that cognitive activity?
Herb, do you want me to
Go ahead.
to take a shot at this? I prefer 50%. just a straight 50% of what the public schools are currently spending, because a lot of the research on privatization says that private provision costs 1/2 on average as much as public provision. It's a nice simple rule, people can understand it. Up in Milwaukee, they're a little bit below 50% right now, and the schools are complaining and saying that it really needs to be higher. I wouldn't go over 50%. I think there's 50% waste in the public schools. This idea of local option choice, as you may know, there's a lot of public school choice already. So in a lot of states, and increasingly even in Illinois, you can take a choice of feeder schools into a high school. They allow that kind of choice. Intra-district and inter-district public school choice is well established, and I think I read recently 70% of all kids actually in public school have a choice of which public school they're attending. That's a big number, so I think that's pretty popular. We like the idea of the parent trigger, which was mentioned only briefly, where if a majority of parents whose children attend a failing public school sign a petition to their school district that says, we want this school shut down or reorganized or flipped into a charter school, or give us vouchers so that we can send our kids to the school of our choice, then the school district has no choice but to do what the parents ask. This would be a radically decentralized reform approach, because if parents are satisfied with the school in Inverness or Bolingbrook or wherever, they won't fill out the petitions. But if they're upset, then at a school level, parents could actually trigger this kind of transformation. And that transformation could just be public school choice, which is basically shut this school down and let us attend a different public school, or a voucher, or a charter school. So we're really keen on that. We had legislation introduced, I think, in 24 states, 25 states this year that would allow that kind of local level transformation. And your first question was, is there a center that does research that looks at the kind of research that Bruno was talking about? The Friedman Foundation, which is in Indianapolis, does a lot of work on this. And University of Arkansas, the Center for School Choice.
I think you've failed to mention the most important one. It's here in Chicago. It's called the Heartland Institute. Yeah.
Heartland Institute does a fair amount of that, yeah.
And we consolidate all the other ones.
Yeah. But University of Arkansas especially, I think, has
Is the 50%
staffed up.
swept out of the local school account at the end of the relevant academic or fiscal year?
Does the local school district then lose the funding that is now going to the private schools that would participate in this hypothetical voucher program? The answer is yes.
So it's paid by, okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. That would be my ideal. Milwaukee's a little different from that. Yes, sir.
What I don't like about the trigger system is what you see in California. It causes local conflict. You'll have one group of parents wanting to preserve the system, another group of parents who don't. And you're seeing this in Chicago with, should we close the school, should we not close the school? I would stay away from the trigger system. I think it's much better to give people the choice of sending their kids where they want. And we may argue whether vouchers are better than the tax credits. But one thing I've read, and tell me whether you agree with this or not, that with tax credits you're less likely to get the religious counter argument. That with vouchers it's the state's money, and some parent is going to send their kids to a religious school. They're less likely to hear this argument if it's a tax credit. How do you respond to that argument?
Yeah.
I know you're all in favor, both of you are in favor of vouchers rather than tax credits, but what about the religious end?
Well, and as Herb has already said, we're both in favor of tax credits as well as vouchers. Given the choice, I think both of us would prefer vouchers because the dollar amount is bigger and it has a more transformative effect on schools by defunding schools when the kids move, just as I was saying to Chris. But we would take tax credits. It's a move in the right direction. There is a lot of popular support for it. The constitutional or legal challenges on religious schools participating, most states have Blaine amendments. Blaine amendments are named after an anti-Catholic bigot from the 19th century who campaigned around the country to get these amendments put on their constitutions that prohibit any public funds from going to religious schools. And as a result, anti-voucher activists win at the first couple of levels in court, and then finally at the U.S. Supreme Court level, the Supreme Court says no. This trumps your First Amendment rights preempt state efforts that might interfere with that right, which is why the voucher programs keep winning when they get up into federal court and at the U.S. Supreme Court level. But to your point, tax credits don't face that same kind of legal challenge at the opening stages, and so they're easier legally in that sense.
I'll just add to that I think it's important for people that advocate privatization to help one another, and the last thing we need to do is to divide the movement. And the tax credits, as Joe and I agree upon, and I said earlier, are less desirable because there are fewer states, and usually the tax credit is much smaller. But it's better than nothing, and I think we have to convince people, and a major consideration is not only the theoretical and actual superiority of one over another, but the feasibility of getting legislation through, because to a large extent it's a tough sell to many legislators. It's still, vouchers, for example, are considered very, very controversial, and so I think we've got to stick together and help one another in getting more of the various kinds of privatization, including charter schools for that matter.
Yeah. So if I sounded too critical of tax credits, I apologize. Judy? I think we'll just work our way around the room if you guys don't mind. It's kind of efficient.
My problem with the tax credit only system is that it still does not help enough people get out of failing schools. You might have, because people who don't have enough money to pay the tuition aren't going to get the tax credit. And we're not only talking about the bottom. Middle class people can't necessarily afford to pay the local Catholic school in order to get the tax credit either.
I agree with that. Now, advocates of tax credits talk about refundable tax credits as a way to address that. And they also talk about advancing the refunds.
Yeah.
And I think, come on, it's easier just to do a voucher. I mean, now you're getting into all kinds of twisting and turning in order to do what vouchers do much more simply. And you also end up with different amounts of tax benefit depending on your income and depending on how many kids. And why not just make it a flat dollar amount per kid? And I think most people understand that intuitively as being more like the current system. So I think they would embrace it. So yes, sir.
A couple comments and a question. With regards to religion in schools, I think there's a lot that we can learn from other countries. I've studied the German school systems a little bit, and from people that have lived in that, what I'm told is that they'll bring in the Catholic catechist or the Lutheran, they call it evangelisch, in there, or a philosophy or ethics person, and they have no problem mixing the two. And there are a lot of other things, but I want to drop that for a second. The other question is with regards to the performance of our students versus those in other countries. How much of that is attributable solely to this question of how we fund our schools and school choice, and how much of it is a societal issue where we have, for instance, I work with a lot of students out in Naperville and Glenelg and Wheaton and so forth. There are a lot of entitled kids out there who get that mentality from their parents, and they just aren't driven to achieve. I see kids with phenomenal test scores, phenomenal grades, who can't write a paragraph. You know, and it's just unbelievable. That was the second comment. The question I had pertains to the difference in cost between a private school and a public school. I'm going to play devil's advocate here. The proponent for the public school is going to say that the private school doesn't have to channel all these resources into the learning challenged kids, the handicapped kids, if I can use that term, or all the other functions that are layered onto a public school. Further, the private school, and I can use local Catholic schools in this case, the teachers are willing to accept lower salaries. Oftentimes, they may be the parents of the students themselves. So, you know, I wonder if when you make that assertion that it can be done more cheaply, do you control for those variables, and how do you counter those arguments?
Well, I'll respond with a couple of points. On your first point about the having public contributions to private institutions, particularly parochial institutions, it's certainly true that in much of Europe,
public funds can go to Lutheran, Catholic, and other schools, whereas in this country, because of the accidents of colonial history, we had the separation of the colonies, and people went to those colonies for religious reasons, and so to have a federal system, you had separation of church and state, so monies couldn't go. But now it's been recognized, actually, at the very highest level, the U.S. Supreme Court, that legislators can give money, in fact, to parochial institutions. Although the main reason why that's not being done, as Joe mentioned, the Blaine amendments, which are at the state level, and that's a huge, huge obstacle. On the question of causality, it is a fact that the U.S. lags, but what are the reasons for it? Well, I agree with you. There are many, many different reasons. Why do we have poor health in the United States, even though we spend tons of money on it? Well, there are, some of the reasons are the public, that it's publicly supported. But in addition to that, a lot of Americans don't take very good care of themselves, and a lot of kids don't get the exercise they need and the fruits and vegetables and things like that. So it's very, very complicated. But when you try to take those things into consideration by, let's say, comparing the top levels only, the upper 5%, it tends to remove that argument. And when you make what is called in statistics regression adjustments for it, where you take those things into consideration, we still do rather poorly. So it's still a matter of grave concern to us.
To follow up on that real quickly, the schools that I work with are some of the top ones in the country. If you go by any of the rankings that they have, I think those are facetious themselves. But even just culturally, whether when I encounter students here from India or Japan or China, it's a matter of great honor to have academic achievement. I mean, to the point that they have high suicide rates in some cultures because of that. And I don't know how you overcome that. So.
Well, it is true, and I think it's hard to make cultural comparisons, but we had Yankee ingenuity and pragmatism were big philosophies in this country, and it's one of our strengths. Because, in engineering and mathematics and some of those other fields that have practical consequences, we've had a long history of doing very, very well. But there's also the dismissive attitude, too. You're a nerd if you study hard. And cultural factors are certainly very, very, including family culture, too, because some parents are somewhat indifferent. Other parents, as you say, and it's related to ethnic status. I completely agree.
I'd like to comment real quickly on that, and then we'll get around to you guys. Clarence Thomas, in his, what do you call it when a Supreme Court justice concurs, but concurring opinion, there we go, said these Blaine amendments are ripe. Somebody's got to start going after them, and the U.S. Supreme Court should just rule them all unconstitutional and force states to get them out of their constitutions. So Clarence Thomas is my favorite Supreme Court justice for that reason, and others. Good schools and good teachers motivate kids, always have, even against tremendous odds. So historically, I think a lot of the motivation for kids getting excited about learning and going on to college would come out of schools and out of teachers, not just from the families. Of course, it's tough when the families aren't there for you. But we have great examples of highly motivated educators doing miracles with kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, and you would hope that they could do miracles with kids from advantaged backgrounds as well. Isn't it ironic that the challenge is the kids with the most advanced advantaged backgrounds now are the underperformers? So, yes, go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I got lost. The cost difference between private and public and the issue of all of the added responsibilities in the public.
Well, that's an argument that's made in the public sector, but I myself am a huge skeptic of special education. I've written on that subject. Kids can be blind and deaf. These are physically diagnosable. But when you get to these other, and I was trained as a psychologist at the University of Chicago, a lot of these other things like mild mental retardation and special learning disabilities are just another way for the public sector to get things bigger and bigger. And the argument has been made, and I believe it, is that the private schools do better because they don't put the kids in those terrible categories. When you're in a category of mild mental retardation, then you've got an excuse not
to learn. So I think some of the added costs, and including, I reviewed and I testified in the Senate committee about it, Chapter 1 for poor kids is one of the biggest of all the sources of federal expenditures, and a whole bunch of comparative studies show that kids that are poor do no better in schools with Chapter 1 than those that don't have it. And it just leads to this more and more and more complicated bureaucracy. You don't even have a principal in charge anymore. You have a bureaucrat in Washington, one in the state at the state level, and one in the big city like Chicago that's running the show rather than right on the spot.
Mm-hmm. It's a good opportunity to say the problem is with the system and not with the teachers or individuals in the system. I mean, Texas and I believe Illinois both have more non-teaching full-time staff in their public schools now than teachers. It's gone over the 50% line. So you've got a counselor and a this and a that for every kid, and that makes it impossible for good teachers to do the job. Yes, sir.
Obviously, Heartland's doing the right thing in terms of the political persuasion that's necessary, since you're focusing on the state legislatures across the country. That's where the power, I guess, resides. If you can convince the state legislatures to change the system of funding, then you win. Do you have to, two things, for instance, well, in Illinois, even if you could win, and if you had legislators that go to, do you go to the legislators, but you also have to focus on where the main problem is, which is the inner city schools? I know Herb's point that we're not doing as well in Trier and other schools, but I think politically you could sell the notion. I think the statistic now is 1 out of every 5 black kids in 4th grade in Chicago public schools reads at grade level. 4 out of 5 don't. Whatever you want to say about New Trier or Winnetka, that's not true. So one, do you have to focus on the inner city, not just whether it's Chicago or Detroit, Cleveland, mainly minority populations, low-income minority populations. Go to the legislators, persuade those folks, and then also, do you need a funding operation? Because if you win their hearts and minds and you persuade these folks and they're truly motivated by doing the right thing, somebody's going to come along, the union's going to say, well, we'll pay you more. And so you need that funding arm as well. Do you have that? Do you have those two things in place? And just think about Chicago. Would you also have to persuade the aldermen here, because those folks, or mayor, is they're influential as to what goes on. In other words, do you have to be playing the political science game more than you are? I know, Joe, you've been doing this all your life, so
Yeah.
Is this the winning strategy, or
It's
just
not.
do what you're doing on ideology?
It's not.
Okay.
We have tried forever to do a low-income pilot program in Chicago. And I wrote down Lee and Audrey Walker. Some of you know Lee Walker. And Lee was a longtime senior fellow at the Heartland Institute, a great guy. He met with Mayor Daley, said, Mr. Daley, the schools are just absolutely horrible in Chicago. I'm here to represent all the black families and low-income families that are getting destroyed by this system. Please do something about it. Mayor Daley said, none of those people vote. There's no constituency. There's no political push. I don't hear people asking for this. So Lee, good luck with that. And we have been trying to build constituencies in the black community. Charles can comment maybe when we come around, but I don't think that's a winning strategy. And you look at Indiana, and they go statewide. Louisiana, statewide. Florida, increasingly statewide. They didn't focus on their cities. Milwaukee, our first program, the first successful voucher program in the modern era, was focused on a single city. Every year, Democrats tried to sabotage, take down, and defund that program, cripple it up with regulations. And they could get away with it. It was a tough fight because the constituency for that program was very small. Milton Friedman said, if you create a program for poor people, you're going to get a poor program. Why? Because poor people don't have clout. It's all about clout, and in an inner city, nobody has that kind of clout.
One quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Is one possible counterexample, but maybe it cuts in your favor. As you know, the Meeks legislation passed the state senate, and it focused on, I think, it was a voucher experiment or voucher program for the bottom decile. I think it was about $4,000, but it passed the state senate, perhaps because of the force of Reverend Meeks, didn't pass the state house. But and of course, you didn't get enough Republicans on the State House side, because basically they were bought out by the unions. I guess you would say that maybe.
It proves my point. And also the broader point that Illinois just sucks politically.
There you go.
Yeah.
You touched on it briefly with the textbooks, and I call it the textbook scam. I have 3 kids in public school in New Trier talking about, so we buy our own textbooks. We don't get them included. And what I don't understand is we have like $90 math books with the internet and technology, and then you got people like giving out free books even. I wonder if this is up at the New Trier Library. I might take it up there.
It will be, yeah, right.
So,
You might need to put a few there, because they'll take them down real quick.
I would like 2 things. Could you comment briefly? I would like to hear a talk on the textbook industry scam, and at another lunch. And
At another lunch.
why are these textbook companies doing this when we can buy a book at Barnes & Noble or Amazon for $10 and they're
Do you
charging
know?
$90? Is this another scam, much like the labor unions having teachers make a lot more than the market value?
Well, I think the reason that they do it is because they can do it and they can get away with it. But in sympathy with some of the publishers, you do have different systems. And Texas and California are the two biggest states, and they're also very forceful. So they decide what curriculum is going to be there, and then the other states tend to imitate that curriculum, but there are variations on it. But I think that there's something that's going to be beyond vouchers. And your question suggested again to me, I'm doing a new book on this. Oh, in fact, Joe and I are doing a new book on this question. We have a chapter on the new technology, and it's just miraculous. And we have the most research now that's been done on colleges and universities. And it indicates, we do meta-analysis. That's when you take all the studies that have ever been done, like 50 studies, and you summarize them. And at the college and university level, it's shown huge effects, much, much better. And you could also say in a more simple-minded way, why should you listen to a 4th grade lecturer when you can hear the best in the world, anytime, any place that you are? And so I think that and you know, college costs, we haven't talked about higher education much, but they've just gone up and up and up. They're even worse than the public schools. And I think we're going to see a real revolution there. And you know, the poor kids in college now, it takes on average 6 years to graduate, even though and one reason that it costs so much.
60% of them do graduate.
Yeah, and many of them don't graduate. So even though the costs have gone, and then when they do graduate, they might owe $20 or $50 or $100,000, you know, for 10 years to get it paid off. But the public schools are a much more likely place to have this happen because you have economies of scale, number one. You could serve millions and millions and billions rather than hundreds and hundreds of thousands of kids. And secondly, the curriculum is much simpler. I mean, if you're talking about arithmetic and algebra, it's so much simpler than, let's say, calculus or differential equations. And I think that it's possible that just as capitalistic technology has revolutionized so many other fields, I think we have a very bright prospects for really major changes, colleges, universities, but most of all of schools.
And the book publishers are resisting it because it is a honeypot for them. You're absolutely right. Did you have a question, Katie? No? I'm getting one last question. Diane, I love you, but Charles had his hand up first. Charles?
Well, you know, we were talking about, you talked about vouchers, Joe. I was involved in a voucher election issue in 2000. It was on the ballot in the state of Michigan, and also it was a campaign issue for Mr. Bush. We did some campaigning in Michigan. Most of the parents there, regardless of ethnicity, wanted vouchers. We came here to Chicago. We met with the Chicago Defender editorial board with, God, I see his face, I can't come up with his name. But he was the chairman of RNC at the time, Jim Nicholson. And they tried to jump on us about why we wanted vouchers. And so when I pointed out that the Joint Center for Political Studies, which is a black think tank in Washington, D.C., came out with a statistic that said over 60-some% of parents wanted vouchers, they almost croaked. They called me, they said, well, you're lying. I said, well, look it up on the internet or call the Joint Center. I mean, no, I'm not. But, you know, you have a serious disconnect between what parents want, what the bureaucracy democracy once, and Karen, what's her name? Karen Lewis. Lewis and I had this debate a couple of weeks ago, and and Karen was saying, I said, well, you know, Karen, your job is to teach. And Karen said, well, no, we have other issues. We have to be psychiatrists, and we have to be sociologists, and you know, we have to be parents to these children. I said, but you're not teaching. That's what you're getting paid to do. But and also, you know, another thing that kind of is interesting. You guys are the statisticians and researchers, but you know, this correlation between being poor and being dumb or an underachiever academically. I really don't see that correlation. When I was coming along, you know, we had people in all socioeconomic categories. Some of the poorest kids were the smartest kids in the class, in our classes. But what I hear around the country from inner city children is one thing and one thing only. And even a very senior level member of Mayor Daley's, or now Rahm Emanuel's cabinet, has said her son is terrified to go to school. She's told me this last week. Terrified. He's so terrified to go to school, she's going to send him to boarding school next year. But this is what you hear all over this city, that the children are terrified to go to school, and the mayor refuses to protect the children.
At the risk of dragging this out, Charles, you mentioned a disconnect. Is it a disconnect between the black community and its leaders more than
Yes.
with policymakers?
Yes, no question.
Yeah, because where are the black leaders? Where are the black
They're in
ministers?
the pockets of the unions.
Yeah.
And the politicians.
And that's what we discovered. We tried to work with black ministers, you know, and if you pay them $50, they'll show up, but they won't come back unless you know, where's the
Feed 'em lunch.
contract?
Send
Yeah,
a car for me.
yeah.
I'd like to say one or two
it
things.
was just infuriating.
Yeah.
For years
in
we worked
defense
on
of
it.
the unions, which I hesitate to do in this group, but they have been enormously successful. We need to remind ourselves, what is the purpose of a union? It's to enhance the welfare of its members and to diminish the amount of work that they do. And so what, teachers have a 6-hour day, they have an 8 or 9 month year, they have tenure, they can't get fired. And you know, the one group that has not been mentioned by anyone, Joe, myself, or anybody here, who really ought to be prosecuted, I think, are the school boards. They're the ones that are supposed to be responsible for the children, not the unions. And that's at the state level, and it's also at the district level. And they're letting the teachers union get away with murder, frankly, because it's the teachers unions, as you suggest, that are running the schools. But it's the school boards that are the ones that are at fault.
The closest I ever came to getting attacked giving a speech was to the Illinois Association of School Board members. I mean, I'd be safer talking to union folks than to school board members. These guys are anti-change, anti-reform. Thank you very much. We're going to stick around, of course. You are welcome to stick around.